for those of us who spend a lot of time working in public policy, working in healthcare, trying to provide accessible, inclusive, accurate information, we want to try to be as equitable as possible so that more and more people can use the work that we are providing to them. And so this body of work that Alice and I have been working on, including several new projects that we're working on, our goal is to help everybody who works in this data flow, this data ecosystem of collecting data, analyzing data, and visualizing or communicating data, do a better job of thinking about the people and the communities that we're focusing on and that we're communicating with. And this work really stemmed out of the racial justice protests in the United States, but also across the world in 2019, 2020, and today, especially after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and of course, unfortunately, far too many others. Alice and I sat down and started talking about how we could be a part of that conversation. As someone who, or as folks who work in a nonprofit focusing on public policy, folks who are spending a lot of time making and working on data visualizations, how could we take part in this conversation? And it turns out that there's really not a lot of work in this area of being more equitable, being more inclusive in our actual data, in how we visualize and communicate our data, which is going to be our main thrust, but we're also going to at least think about, we probably don't have a lot of expertise to add about how we collect data. Neither of us are, survey methodologists, but certainly in how we collect data and of course how we analyze data, but we're going to focus on data analysis. Now, before we get into content, just do a bit of level setting here. So I'm a obviously white male based here in Virginia, outside Washington, D.C. So my experience is going to be very different than many other people that we are going to talk about and focus on today when it comes to different racial groups, different ethnic groups. Also, we won't talk about it too much today, but also this work expands to, and we are doing work on it today, across categories or categorizations of gender and sexuality, religion, all sorts of other groups and their intersections. We'll primarily focus on race and ethnicity today. Now, I am Jewish. I have had my own experience with anti-Semitism here in the U.S., but that experience is still very different than being a Black or African American person, for example, in the United States, where I might be afraid of what happens if I'm pulled over by the police, or not being able to walk down, the street in my neighborhood at nighttime with a hooded sweatshirt. But that being said, someone who spent a lot of time in public policy, spent a lot of time with the federal government before moving over to urban, who thinks a lot about communicating data, and just also is like a member of society. These are important issues and ones that we should be thinking about and being more aware of, especially for those of us who are working in the data sector, the data area of our organizations, who may have a lot of power in terms of gatekeeping our work before it gets out into the world, right? So you might be the data person or the data visualization person or or part of the graphics desk at your organization, and you might get close to the final say of the visualization before it goes out into the world. And so we have especially in those instances, we have potentially a lot of power to say to our colleagues or to our managers or to whomever, to say, hey, maybe we can do a better job with how we are talking about and representing people in this visualization, be it the colors that we use, the language we use, the icons that we're using, any of the sorts of things that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Now, and I also just want to make sure I distinguish between the American experience, which is what we are primarily focused on in this work, versus the experience in other countries, right? So just because we're talking to a group in Halifax, right, the difference in the relationship between federal governments and indigenous or native populations in the US and Canada are just very different, right? As one example, I'll give you a sort of separate example. We did a talk a few months ago, and someone during the Q&A, someone said in South Africa, categories for race are white, Black, and colored. And of course, in the US, we would never use the word colored, especially on a federal survey. But in South Africa, the word colored has a totally different connotation. So there, it's a word that doesn't have the same meaning as it does in the United States. So I just want to make sure that we have that distinction, that we're primarily focused on the US experience because we're both work and based in the US, but that these experiences, the categories I'm going to talk about, the way that we talk about and visualize race and ethnicity are going to differ potentially very substantially between different countries and different regions of the world. Now, the one thing that we don't do in this report is talk about visualizations that are explicitly racist. There are unfortunately lots of examples of those. This is just one example. This is known as a redlining map. Redlining maps were created in the United States by a federal agency known as the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So the HOLC is its abbreviation. The HOLC's job, this is in the 1930s and 1940s, the HOLC's job was to assess mortgage risk in neighborhoods in major metropolitan areas around the country. And so what they would do is they would create maps like the one you see in front of you. This is a map for Chicago. And they would go in and they would assess mortgage risk, right? And so low value, high value neighborhoods in these, for example, in Chicago. And they would create these maps. And so in this map of Chicago, the blue and the green areas are considered low mortgage risk or high value. And then the red neighborhoods are considered high risk or low value, right? And so a red neighborhood earned that color if any African-American person lived in that neighborhood. Okay, and it didn't matter what the average income was in that neighborhood. It didn't matter the quality of the housing, right? All that mattered is that if there was a Black or African-American person living in that neighborhood earned a red color, and hence the term redlining maps. And so when people look at these maps, they may not instinctually or immediately think of them as being racist, but they obviously are. But I want to show you is a description that the HOLC wrote about this map. I'm going to just give you a second to read this statement that they wrote about this map of Chicago. And I think as we read this sentence, we can all agree that this is an explicitly racist sentence, but not everybody necessarily upon first view of the map necessarily sees it as a racist map. And these maps, to hammer home the point of why we think this is so important, right? That these maps have had a long and important and enduring impact on especially the wealth accumulation among African-American and Black-headed households. And particularly in the United States, where the main transmission of wealth between generations is from our houses, from our homes, from the value in our homes. This impact extends not just to the people who were living in those neighborhoods at the time, but in their children, their grandchildren, and in those neighborhoods more generally. And over the last year or so, we've seen more and more coverage of this. This is from a story from 538 back in December, where they found that the segregation that existed back when the HOLC created their maps still exists in some of these major metropolitan areas, that they sort of created this segregation. In a story from Washington Post a couple of months ago, they found that air quality was worse in those redline neighborhoods than in the other neighborhoods in these maps. So you can see that these maps have had a really large impact on American society over the last almost 100 years. Now, as interesting as you might find that discussion, that's not what we're going to focus on. What we're going to focus on and hopefully provide you with today are some practical ways that you can make your work more equitable, more inclusive. And the way that we're going to help you do that, or hope to help you do that, is that we talk to about 24 people across a variety of sectors, from economics to sociology to public policy, public health, data journalists, to talk about and find what are some of the I'm going to call them best practices. I'm not even sure best practices is the right word. Certainly not rules, barely guidelines, questions you should ask yourself when it comes to working with your data. And the main theme that came through from those discussions is that we as people working with data need to demonstrate empathy for the people and communities that we're focusing on. And one of our interviewees, a data journalist by the name of Kim Bui, who's I believe still based in Arizona, she put this really succinctly. She said, if I were one of the data points on this visualization, would I feel offended? I think this is just a really easy, great way for us to think about how we can be more inclusive and more equitable in our work. When you look at that data visualization or that graph or that table or that diagram or that illustration, put yourself in the shoes of the person or the people, the community that you are representing. And are the colors that you're using, the words that you're using, the icons that you're using, are those the types of things that you would want to see people describe you as a human being or as a community or as a country? So I'm going to try to give you just a few parts out of this report. I'll put a link into the report in the chat box in a little bit. But I'm going to give you some of the most practical pieces out of the report that I hope you can use this afternoon. You go back to your desk, you're working with your chart or your table, or you're developing your next survey. Hopefully you can incorporate some of these today. There are lots of other pieces in the report that are a little bit broader, maybe some more philosophical or principles or bigger issues that we're not going to be able to solve today. But as I said, for those of us who are working with data all the time, these are the things that we can do this afternoon to make our work I would say better. So I'm going to start with language. Language is, I think, one of the more natural ways for us to think about being more inclusive and being more equitable, right? The words that we want to use in our work and what we say to people. The challenge, of course, with language generally is that it's changing and it's nuanced and it's evolving. The words that we use today may not be the words we used yesterday, may not be the words that we use tomorrow. And so that's sort of a challenge. When it comes to the disability community, there's a movement towards using the phrase, towards using people first language. So instead of saying disabled people, we say people with disabilities. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to every group within that sort of aggregate umbrella. As an example, this organization, which is an advocacy group for autism, they polled their members, and more than 80% of their members said that they prefer identity first language rather than person first language. So instead of saying people or person with autism, they prefer autistic person. So again, there's nuance here. Things are changing, and what we might think is sort of an aggregate may not necessarily hold for all different parts of that aggregate, different regions, different localities, all those sorts of different smaller pieces. Or sections of an identity. Let's take another example. And again, this is particular to the United States. I'm not exactly sure about the Canadian experience, but in the US, we have for about, I'd say 40, 50 years, used the words Hispanic and Latino to describe that aggregate population. And before that, we would use sort of individual words or phrases, right? So there are people from Puerto Rico, there are people from Cuba, there are people from Mexico, right? And sort of in the 60s and 70s, we sort of evolved and through a variety of different processes. There's a great book from a sociologist at UC Berkeley about the sort of origins of the word Hispanic and Latino. But we've been using those words since about the 60s and 70s. And more recently, we've seen this evolution towards this word Latinx. And Latinx tries to get around the gender binary in the word Latino, which either has the suffix O or A. But people, sometimes say it's hard to pronounce. It doesn't really make sense. And so, should we really be using that? And the question is, well, how do we know whether that's an acceptable word? Well, the easiest way is to ask people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. And oddly enough, the first major survey I could find about this didn't occur until August of 2020. So in August of 2020, the Pew Research Center did a survey of people who identified as Hispanic or Latino. And 2/3 of that sample said that the word Latinx should not be used to describe that population. Okay. So then a year later, we see another survey from the Gallup organization. This is in July of 2021. They again interviewed people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. Which term do you prefer? 23% said Hispanic, 15% Latino, only 4% said they prefer the word Latinx, and then 57% said it doesn't matter. And then Gallup did something very smart, and they said, okay, if you had to choose, what term would you choose? Now you have to choose, again, among people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, 57% said Hispanic, 37% said Latino, and only 5% said Latinx, and still 2% said they had no opinion. So I don't think there was a third follow-up to this question, although they, really make sure that 2% of people really answered. But you can see here, there's really limited support for the word Latinx. And one more piece of evidence, this is from December, just a few months ago. Which of the following terms comes closest to describing your ethnic background? This is, again, among people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, only 2% said they use the word or the term Latinx. And then they said, okay, does that bother you if the word Latinx is used? And 40% said, yeah, it bothers me at least a little bit. And 57% said it doesn't bother me. But at least 40%, it's a big share of people said that it bothers them at least a little bit, right? And again, if we take that idea or that concept of empathy, if 4 out of 10 people said that this is a phrase that bothers them, then maybe that's a phrase that we don't want to use. And over the past, I would say, couple of years, we've seen a growth in the word Latina, which is also trying to get around the gender binary of the word Latino, but maybe not as difficult to say, maybe a little more, a little bit easier to use. But again, we'll have to see when the Gallup poll and some of these other organizations start to ask people, do you prefer the term Latina versus Hispanic or Latino? And of course, again, these terms and preferences for these terms is surely going to vary, probably by region, but I would guess in this particular case, probably also by age and generation. I'm sure there are some differences there, and only with more surveys and more data will we know the answer. Okay, so now that you sort of get a sense of language, let's look at data visualization in particular. So what you see here is what's called a bivariate choropleth map of counties in the United States. And I'm going to zoom in on the legend, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm just going to explain to you what you're looking at first. There are 3 maps in this Tableau dashboard. I'm only going to show you this top one, labeled black here. So let me first explain what you're looking at. So a little data viz 101. So this is called the choropleth map. I should have built one for unemployment rates across the provinces. That would have been a little more natural for you all. But okay, so map of the United States, level map of the United States. What we have here is called a sequential color palette. So we go from light blue to dark blue, where the light colors are for states that have a low unemployment rate, and dark blue are for states that have a high unemployment rate. So you've surely seen maps like this before. So this has a weird name, but is what we call, these are called choropleth maps. So this map is called a bivariate choropleth map. And what that means is, instead of having just one variable, so just the unemployment rate, we're going to have 2 variables on this map. So let me show you what we have here. I'll zoom in. So along the vertical dimension, the first variable we look at is poverty, labeled here as more poverty, so the poverty rate. And along the horizontal dimension is the label more black, okay? So what this means is those counties that have that yellowish, orangish, peachish color in the bottom left, it's kind of in the middle part of the country, those are counties that have a lower density of Black or African-American residents and a lower poverty rate. And then in the counties that have a higher poverty rate and a higher density of Black or African-American residents, that's in that very, very dark purple, that almost black color. So that's how, and that's in like the southeastern part of the United States. Okay, so that's how you basically read this bivariate choropleth map. Okay, now past data viz 101, you've got that. Let's look at the words that are used here. Well, on the vertical dimension, we have this phrase more poverty. Well, poverty is an experience. It's not a static description of a person or a household, right? My income could place me below the poverty line this year, but not necessarily next year. It doesn't describe me as a person, right? But more importantly for this body of work is the phrase on the horizontal dimension, which is more black. And black, of course, that phrase more black, the word black references skin color, doesn't reference people. And if we think about being more equitable and being more inclusive and being more empathetic, think about, would you want to be described as more of that thing, right? For me, it might be more Jewish. That's not something I want to, that's not how I would want to be described, or it's not how I want to see myself being described in this particular map. So what might be some alternatives? Well, I could use something like larger proportion of the Black population, or larger proportion of people in poverty, or poverty rate, or percent of people in poverty, right? Something where we're identifying and talking about people. Now, these labels aren't they're not as concise, they're more verbose, they're longer, they don't fit as nicely on the legend or in the table or in the bar chart. But again, how do we want to, would we feel offended if we were labeled as more Black, right? Like, how does that make us feel? And I'll just make one last point here before moving on, that the original author of this visualization eventually went and changed the original, after some conversations we had, went back and changed it to larger Black population, away from more Black. And again, I know the person who created this. I reached out and I said, hey, it's not like I knew the answer. I'm like, I just feel like more Black is not a phrase that I would want to use. It's not a phrase that I feel is inclusive. And I think I only tell this story because I think it's important for us to be able to have these conversations. Like, they went back and made this change. And then they were gracious enough to let us include the visualization in these slides and in the report. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And if we are able to have these conversations, we can ultimately just do better work and just improve. Last thing I'll say, and this is just a picture from a botanical gardens near my house here in Virginia. Like, the words that everybody uses doesn't have to be the words that we use. Like, I love that they use the phrase super adults here, like just more affirming, just more positive, just like terrific, right? Like, so just because we use phrases like, not that 55 plus is senior citizens or elderly, but I'm just saying, I got not yelled at, but someone chastised me the other day. They were like 55. They're like, I'm not elderly. And I was like, that's not what I meant. But I'm just saying, like, we can come up with words that are maybe a little bit better, a little more affirming. And we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about ordering labels. So I am by training an economist. So these are just 4 random tables from 4 random economics journals. And you'll notice, if you look kind of carefully at the order of the race variables here, that they're always white, Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and then other. It's basically just that, more or less that order. And the question is why? And why does it have to be that way, right? Why do we have to put white in the first position? And again, for other characteristics, why do we put male in the first position, right? Like, that's just suggesting a norm or a default. This is from the US decennial census. This is a question on race. And you notice here that the way that this is set up reflects that order that I just showed you. So the first option here is white with a little checkbox, and you can write in some more detail. And then there's a box for Black or African American, and then American Indian or Alaskan Native. And then we have a group below that, Chinese, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, and so on. And then we have some other race at the very bottom. And what you'll see is, this is from the American Community Survey, which is also run by the Census Bureau. White at the top. Then this is basically the same question, just used in a different survey. Even in the current population survey, which is run monthly, we see white in that first position, then Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and then 6 is other. And you see these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how the data is coded, right? So if you go download the current population survey, this is how it's coded in the data. So if you ran, if you calculated the mean, not that that's a meaningful statistic, but if you calculated the mean, you get a number of, I don't know, whatever it is, 2.4. Not that number is meaningful, but that's how the numbers show up in the data. And the question is, do we need to have white in that first position and Black in that number 2 position, coding in that way? You can see here from the survey of income and program participation, we have 7 options with 1 is white and 2 is Black. We can see from the survey of consumer finances from the Federal Reserve Board, 1 is white, 2 is Black, 3 is Hispanic, -7 is other. Panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan. Again, 7 options, same basic ordering. And then we have the consumer expenditure survey with 9 different options. Again, basically that same ordering. So it doesn't really surprise me when I see tables like this. They're just taking the data, right? And they're just providing the estimates based on those categories and just using the numbers. So not really thinking about how those are presented. And the argument I think that we make here is to just think about the order that you're using. I'll give you another couple of examples here. Well, I'll ask you this one, maybe make a little interactive. What do you observe about the ordering of the data in this table? And I'm gonna try to take a cup of tea without choking on it this time, be my goal. So we have, the two dimensions along the first column and along the top row. What do you observe here? Just some simple observations. Okay, so two sips of tea is enough. So along the column here, that first column, notice that the banks are all listed alphabetically, right? Atlanta at the top and St. Louis at the bottom. But that's not the same across the columns. It's unclear how they've ordered this. Like my first thought was they sorted it by the number, but that isn't the case either for the board at the top or the total at the bottom. So again, why is white in that first position? This is the screen that you get to when you try to get a COVID test at CVS here in the US, and notice a drop-down menu for race. Sort of in the middle there is other, patient refused, and unknown. It may seem kind of awkward or different to see those three options kind of in the middle of the drop-down menu, but just listing them alphabetical sort of, is kind of a natural way to set this up. And so you make that decision to make them alphabetical. And so this leads to just asking some questions with your data as you're working through them. Does your study focus on a community? And if it does, maybe you should present those results first, right? Maybe there's an argument or a story that you're trying to tell. And maybe if you're doing that, the order should match in your presentation and in the graphs or the tables. And then finally, maybe you can use a quantitative relationship. Again, maybe it's the magnitude of the effect or the estimates, or maybe it's the sample size, or maybe it's the population size, or maybe it's alphabetically. And you might end up with the order being, white and then black. I mean, that might be the order you end up in. But our argument here is to at least encourage you to think about it. And if you come up with that same listing that we just showed you, the same order that I just showed in those examples, but you end up in the same position, at least you said, well, I've thought about it. This is a conscious decision I've made to list them in this way. I've listed it by population, and just this is how the populations shake out, and that's how they are. And I've thought about it. And that's really what we're encouraging people to do here, is to really just, have more conscious, a thoughtful approach to how they talk about and visualize data when it comes to different demographic groups. Let's talk about missing groups. I'm going to talk about missing groups and then color, then hand it over to Alice. So missing groups, we think of differently than missing data, right? So missing data, you have your survey, some group of people didn't answer the question about income. They didn't answer the question about how far they think the Leafs are going to go in the playoffs because they didn't want to jinx it, right? So you have missing data, okay? That's different than missing groups. Missing groups are thinking about people who are not actually, don't have the option to answer the question. They're not represented in the survey. So I think the easiest, for me at least, the easiest way to think about this is gender. We know gender is not binary, and yet all of those surveys I just showed you, and I'm sure many, many more, the selection of options on gender is male or female, right? And also notice that they all have male in the first position and female in the second position, right? So like, why do we have males number one? Like, that's a question worth asking. There are bad ways to do this. There are bad ways to create these options. These are just a selection of some bad ones. My favorite is the top right one, because if I was faced with this drop-down menu, I wouldn't know which option to select. The options are male, female, and human, and I wouldn't know which one I'm supposed to choose because two of them are a subset of one of them. So I'm not really sure what to do with that. But let's get back to race. So if I go to the American Community Survey, I can calculate poverty rates for our 6 major groups. Okay, and you might get, this is what we calculated. These are not the official poverty rates, but this is what we calculated, relatively quickly. You get a rate of 9.7% all the way up to 23%. Now, you can go in and look at more detail, the more detailed racial codes, because people can write in their more detailed races. And if you do the same calculation of poverty rate by those more detailed groups, you see a huge variation. So let's just look at that bottom group here, the Asian or Pacific Islander group. Even though the overall rate is 9.7%, we get a range of, from about 5% to almost 30%. And so even though the sample size for some of these other dots is going to be quite small, remember that there's huge variation within these aggregate groups. And again, there's a tension between trying to represent everybody and the science when it comes to statistical significance and hypothesis testing. But and even if that's the case, it is worth considering or thinking about or making clear in the work, in the writing, in the graph to say, yeah, we're only talking about, or we're only listing here results for these 6 aggregate groups, but we recognize that there's huge variation within these particular groups that may affect our recommendation. For example, Asian and Pacific Islanders, the experience in America for Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, just as an example, are very different than for many Pacific Islander groups who have much higher rates of poverty, much higher rates of unemployment, and so on and so forth. And so those 2 groups really differ in their experiences. Let's talk about the word other real quickly, because this is a big one, because we're literally othering people. Like it doesn't get much better example of othering people than calling people other. And here's the definition of the word other from the dictionary. What strikes me in the definition is this last entry in the dictionary, that somehow this word, the people here who are check the box for the category other in the survey, there's somehow the connotation there is they are somehow disturbing or they're somehow a threat. And so the question is, how can we get around, or how can we not other this group, even though they are not represented in the survey? Now, a lot of people have suggested, the word and other, which obviously could work. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a grammar issue, but I think we could kind of get around the grammar problem here, right? But we think there are some other options as well. Here's a list of alternatives that we think that are reasonable alternatives to the word other. And I'll also just say, if you're a quantitative person like me, you might get a little worried about changing the word other in your work, because the word other is what the person checked. That's the option they selected in the survey, right? And so is it okay for us to change that word in our graph or in our report or whatever? And I think, as long as you acknowledge in the work to say, the ACS or whatever survey use the word other, we are going to use the phrase identity not listed. I think you sort of covered your bases. And it should be noted that all of these are factual. All of these are true. Just as the word other is the option that they selected, all of these are accurate descriptions of that group. Now, regardless of whether you want to change the word other, or you like some of these, or you have other ideas, which would be great, I think we can all agree that when CNN used the phrase something else, that's something that we do not want to use. Again, how would you feel if you were described as something else? I mean, I don't know what they were thinking here. They were trying to get around the word other and just pick something worse. I don't really know what the thought process was here, but not a good decision. Okay, the last section for me is on using colors, because color is such an important part of the data visualization toolkit. It's really important to think about how you represent people when you use color. I'm going to zoom in here on the legend in a second so you can see what's being shown here. But this is a dashboard, a Tableau dashboard from MIT, showing trends in diversity and racial groups at the university, and the student body at the university. So the left chart here is just a line chart showing change over time in these different racial groups. And then the bar chart on the right is a breakdown of those different groups by different colleges or schools. I don't know. I went to public school, so I don't really know. I'm not smart enough to go to MIT, so I don't really know. So let me zoom in on the legend here. So there are 9 categories included in this dashboard. We start with Black or African American students on the top left, it's shown in the dark red, Asian students in the bottom left in the lighter red, and then in the next column we have students who identify as 2 or more races in the lightest red color, and then we have students who identify as white in the blue color, and then the 2 shades of gray. So these are the 9 groups shown in that dashboard. And there are at least 2 problems with this color palette, the color palette that's being used here. The first problem is that notice that all students of color are lumped in these shades of red, and that the white students are the only students that get their own blue color. And so the suggestion here is that we should somehow compare all of these other student groups to white students. That's the default, that's the norm, that's the baseline we should compare with. Second problem is even more problematic. So let's go back to our choropleth map. Remember this from earlier. So we had states with low unemployment rates in the light blue and states with the high unemployment rate in the dark blue. So that's a sequential color palette. So it's just using shades of blue, right? Well, this MIT dashboard is using similarly shades of red. And so the implication here is that somehow Black or African American students are somehow more than or greater than students who identify as Asian or as two or more races, right? Now, I don't think the creator of this visualization came to this selection of colors from a racist position or malicious intent, just not knowing that this is what sequential color palettes imply, right? So after some, and I would say for Twitter, gentle feedback. For Twitter, it was gentle feedback. Okay, so so a month later, they revised the dashboard. This is what they came up with. I'll again show you the legend, and you can see here they've made some changes, but we still get these shades of blue for 4 or 5 of these different groups. Now, I'm also not saying it's easy to pick 9 different colors. Like, that's not an easy thing to do, right? This is a 9 color palette swatch from Color Brewer, which is one of the color tools out there that people really like, really easy to use. But notice that even when I pick the 9 colors, I still get some shades of oranges and greens and blues. And so, we still end up with that particular problem. And so the question is, are there some alternatives? Is there a better way, different strategies we can use to present data like this? And now I'm going to turn it over to Alice so she can tell you how to do that.
All right, thank you, John. Yeah, so I'm going to walk you all through a time where we at Urban tried to deliberately and consciously apply racial equity awareness to the way we were visualizing and presenting some data. This is for a project I worked on summer of 2020 called Tracking COVID-19's Effects by Race and Ethnicity. Now, the goal of this project was to measure the disparate effects the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the health, housing, and livelihoods of communities of color. So we use weekly data from the US Census Bureau to measure the share of households experiencing things such as food insufficiency, income loss, difficulty paying rent or mortgage, etc. In the final interactive tool, users can choose between different metrics to see how that has changed over time by race or ethnicity at different levels of geography. But what you see here is our initial idea for how to visualize this data. What we have is a multi-line line chart. So each racial or ethnic group is represented with their own individual line, and the lines show how the metric has changed for that particular group over time. And given this type of data, this is a perfectly reasonable and valid chart type to choose. We have something changing over time, so we usually think to use a line chart. We want to show that thing by different groups, different mutually exclusive groups, so why not use a multi-line line chart? But given that the explicit goal of this project was about racial and ethnic disparities, the team really wanted to challenge ourselves to see if the way we were showing this data really upheld ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And the more we thought about it, the more we became concerned that there might be some potential drawbacks to using a multi-line line chart. We were concerned that such an approach might encourage comparisons of each group to the best performing group. I think as human beings, when we are presented with a bunch of lines in close proximity to each other, we instinctively start to look for patterns and relationships and trends among these lines, right? Which lines are at the top, which lines are at the bottom, where do lines cross or intersect? And this can have 2 negative side effects. One of which is that it could focus attention on what the low performing groups are quote unquote lacking, rather than how members of all races and ethnicities have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. And similarly, it can also make it seem like the best performing group is the goal that the other groups should seek to achieve, even though readers really should be considering the specific needs and challenges facing each group. So we kept thinking about this, we kept brainstorming and iterating, and eventually we came up with this as our final design. Now, a lot has changed here, so let me walk you through all these changes. First off, you'll see that we are no longer using lines. Instead, we have these sorts of dots and these blocks going on. And what this is all about is that the dots represent our point estimates for these metrics, and the blocks are the confidence intervals around our estimates. And we use transparency here to indicate whether or not differences were statistically significant. So the more opaque dots and blocks mean that there was a difference that was statistically significant. whereas the more transparent ones meant that the difference was not found to be statistically significant. We thought that it was important to show uncertainty around these estimates, especially since some of these groups, as John mentioned earlier, have very small sample sizes. So we didn't want readers to walk away thinking that there was a statistically significant disparity when there wasn't one, or vice versa. Now, another big change that we made here was that rather than cramming all of the groups onto the same chart, we've actually broken this out by into a set of 6 small multiples. So now each group is represented by their own separate chart. And we felt that using a small multiples approach would not promote any one particular group as the standard or implied standard that other groups needed to match, and might better encourage users to consider the specific needs of each group individually. Now, working with 6 charts gave us a lot more space to work with, and allowed us to add a consistent benchmark that could be used across all the groups. Here, the relevant state or metro area average. And finally, I should also mention that on the topic of ordering, we chose to order the small multiples alphabetically. Because this is a dynamic interactive tool, we didn't want the order of the charts to go flying around every time a user just made a new selection. We felt that having the charts in a fixed order would provide for a better user experience. So this is how we thought through this particular project. Again, also want to reiterate, I'm not saying this is the only approach or the best approach. There are no hard and fast rules here, but I hope this gives you some insight into the issues that we thought about and why we made the design decisions that we did. All right, so wrapping up, just want to leave you all with a couple of last questions to think about in terms of how to engage or reflect lived experiences as you work with and communicate data. So first off is, are we using language that is consistent with how people refer to themselves and others? As John mentioned at the top of this talk, language is always changing, and even members within the same community don't always agree on how they best want to be referred to or labeled. So it's always important to consult with people, members of the community or experts on the community, to figure out what are the most appropriate terms or language to use to refer to these groups. Next, what have we missed in our visuals that are inconsistent within a racial equity framework? Hopefully the topics we talked about today give you some concrete ideas to work off of, but it's always great to get feedback when possible from people who your data and research is about, or from just a diverse group of people who can help you point out what you have missed within your work that might be inconsistent here. And finally, how can we take a more empathetic approach to creating data visualizations that accurately and respectfully account for other people's lived experiences? Remember that quote from Kim Bui, right? If I were a data point on this visualization, would I feel offended? I think that's just really important, succinct way, thing to keep in mind as you work with and communicate data. And so finally, it's also just really important to remember that data are a reflection of the lives of real people. They're not just some sterile abstraction. The numbers that you have in your spreadsheet, in your database, come from someone who's shared their lives, shared their experiences with you. So it's important to remember to embrace empathy and humanity as you work with and communicate data. So thank you very much. That's what we have here for you today. I think we have time for some questions if anyone has any questions.